Morning all. Today we'd like to talk about the structure and genre of the book of Esther, talking about a little bit about point of view and how the narrative unfolds. The first thing I'd like to talk to you about is where this book falls within both the Christian and in the Jewish canon. In the order for the books of Ruth, Song of Songs, Ecclesiastes, Lamentation, and Esther are different in the Christian canon, and they're even represented differently in various traditions of the Jewish Masoretic text and so forth. First of all, in the Christian canon, you'll find, for example, in the Oxford Study Bible, that these are arranged chronologically according to the authorship of the proposed author. Ruth follows after Judges because of the sentence in the days when the judges ruled. Esther then follows after Ezra and Nehemiah because of chronological issues. Ecclesiastes and Song of Songs follow the Psalms and Proverbs. And then Lamentations follows the book of Jeremiah all the way in the prophets because this was thought to be the person who actually wrote Lamentations in history. In our current situation, you may have a Bible that does not have the book with the additions in it, or you may have one like the new RSV version with Apocrypha, which is where you'll find the Greek translation with the different additions. In some of these, they've actually interlaced them with the story where they belong. In other versions, they will take these additions and put them after the story, so you have to sort of figure out for yourself where to put them. Now, if you look in a Jewish study Bible, the formal Jewish study Bible from Oxford Press, same press that as put out the Oxford Study Bible for the NRSV, you'll find that the books are divided up into the Torah, the Nevi'im, and the Ketuvim being the writings. And the 5 books we're talking about were located together in something called the scrolls. And they're located according to liturgical order, and this is quite interesting. The Song of Songs is read in Jewish tradition in the spring, about April, in commemoration of the new year. Ruth is read on Shavuot in May or June at the celebration of the giving of the law. Lamentations is regularly read on the 9th of Av in July and August, and that particular date is very strong in the Jewish tradition, being the date of the when the Jews were taken into captivity, but also being the date of other significant events. So the 9th of Av is a day of collective lamentation. Ecclesiastes is read during the Festival of Booths during Sukkot, and Esther is read, of course, in the springtime, probably March, for the celebration of Purim. Now, Purim is a celebration that was not ordained by the Mosaic Law, so it's a later addition here, and this book is seen to be the justification for celebrating Purim. And a really interesting question to ask ourselves is, if we're looking at this book looking at our Bible as our rule of faith and practice, what do we do with Purim? Because there's very definite instruction to celebrate this on a certain day. The Christian community sort of doesn't do that, and I've always found that to be really interesting because it sounds really quite fun, the way that the Jewish community celebrates Purim. So that's a question actually for another day, but it is a really legit question when we look at how we read text and how one community picks it up and rolls with it, and the other one reads it and then sort of leaves it there on the page. In the Biblia Hebraica, the Megillot are in a more traditional order, actually. So you have Ruth, then Song of Songs, Ecclesiastes, Lamentations, and then finally Esther. So in the Jewish tradition, Esther lands at the end, whether they're putting them in liturgical order, as the Jewish Study Bible does, or if you're putting them in Biblia Hebraica order themselves. So then we can ask, what are the differences between the Hebrew and the Greek versions? Now, typically, if we're reading, for example, in the Pentateuch, we can look at the Septuagint, and it's quite like what we would find in the Hebrew text. However, for the book of Esther, this is probably one of the books that has the most variation between the Hebrew and the Greek versions. And there's more than one Greek version, so you end up with a couple of different ways of looking at it. And why is this important? It is important because it's story. And the narrative is unfolding, and the plot is unfolding. So when we get these different chunks of text in the Greek version that are not in the Hebrew, we can ask, why are they here? What are they doing here? Mainly, the biggest difference is that the Hebrew doesn't mention God or religion. Okay, so for us reading that, it's a little bit enigmatic. Where is God in all of this? And you'll find discussions and arguments for God being present but not mentioned and that kind of thing. The Greek translators found a problem with that. And so in these editions, we find prayers. The name of God occurs many, many times. And for example, Esther, like Daniel, chooses her diet very carefully to fit in with the dietary requirements. So there's ways there that the book of Esther in the Greek version presents a little bit more along the lines of actual practice. Okay, so if we're looking at the idea of structure and plot and point of view in the book of Esther, we'll find some really interesting things. With regard to genre, which we've talked about for our own passages, Adele Berlin notes that Esther is best read as comedy. So if you've already read Esther and you've read it like I typically do in a rather sober way, have a read again and go, if this was comedy, what would I see here that would be sort of funny? Because if you do read it that way, there are things in there that are so kind of outlandish that they are comedic and funny. And you realize that this particular story is maybe a little different than we've tried to make it in the past. Okay, so the point being made through comedy or through an entertaining text could be a similar point to what we would make, but it also could have a different way of coming across. The idea of comedy there that Berlin talks about is highlighted with the idea that the women are in the harem for a whole year, putting on their cosmetics before they go in to see the king. The king holds drinking banquets all the time. There are 10 of them. And it seems almost irreverent the way that the court is being portrayed. When I read it the last time, not long after having seen the most recent version of Beauty and the Beast, I could hardly but think that they were saying, be our guest, come on in, be our guest. So if you read Esther in that sort of sense, we might have some sort of comic relief, but also some very serious issues arising. So don't be afraid to read maybe with a little different pair of eyes than you normally will. It doesn't mean that you'll need to go back and revise everything, but it is really fun to look at the Book of Esther through Adele Berlin's version of reading, which is read this as comedy. Okay. Berlin also notes usefully that the plot is structured on improbabilities, exaggerations, misunderstandings, and reversals. Okay, so a few of the things here are the fact that Esther hides her identity, even though everyone knows who her uncle is. Okay, a teeny minority of Jews go out and kill 75,000 enemies. Okay, and Haman, in order to make his point, builds a 7-story stake to impale his enemies, which of course we find later is kind of put to the reverse use. Now, how does one structure a story like this? Because it looks like there are actually traces of different kinds of storytelling that are all put together in the Book of Esther. One source talks about Vashti, the story about Vashti being a harem tale, something similar to Joseph and Potiphar's wife, okay, a tale that's told within a harem setting. The story of Mordecai comes across as court intrigue. Okay, so we have a little bit more of this back and forth going on and how am I going to get what I want and that sort of thing. And then finally we have the story of Esther herself, which is a story of success and of deliverance. Okay, so it's been also pointed out that it's a chiastic pattern of plot development. First, Ahasuerus has a feast, and he chooses Esther in Esther 1 and 2. And then the second part, Haman plots to destroy the Jews. Ahasuerus promotes Haman, and Haman plots to kill the Jews. Esther then risks her life, and then Haman plots to kill Mordecai. The risking of her life of Esther in 4:16 is probably the best known version or verse out of this entire story. If I die, I die. She works up her courage to go in there and says, okay, I'm going to go, and if I die, that's counting the cost, what's going to happen. The third part here is that Esther foils Haman's plot. Okay, here comes our strong female character, and she manages to get in there and put a spoke in the wheel, as they would say. Ahasuerus asks Haman how to honor Mordecai. Esther intercedes for the Jews, or excuse me, Ahasuerus has Haman honor Mordecai after he has asked Haman, what should I do for this person I want to honor? That's one of the best reversals in the whole story, and reminds me a little bit about the story of David and Nathan, where Nathan says, what would you do to somebody who took the only lamb that belonged to somebody? And then kind of gives him a zinger, you are the man. So here we have that same sort of thing. What would you do to this person? And the plot thickens when Haman himself has to then go do all those things to Mordecai in chapter 6. Esther intercedes for the Jews, and she does this with quite a lot of emotion. Finally, Haman is killed on his very tall stick, and Ahasuerus promotes Mordecai, who then delivers the Jews. Okay, so we see in the story, unlike Ruth and the story of Ruth and Naomi, where all the characters that are speaking and alive are female, this one has a strong female protagonist, but there are lots of male characters in there as well. So there's a lot of characterization that's going on, and I would say it's a broader scenario than what you get in the book of Ruth in a sense, because we've got so many characters planning and plotting and so forth and so on. One good question to ask after you read edition D is, what does this do to our characterization and the picture in our mind of Esther as a strong character? Okay, so that's something to keep in mind. Now, I found some interesting things when I was reading this about the point of view, and the idea that this is so much told by the narrator that the speech in most cases is actually indirect speech. So it's harder a little bit to track who's talking to whom, because a lot of it is like, and so he said to him, and it's this indirect type of speech. We know what they said, but we only know it through the narrator's voice. I found it really interesting that some of the reversal is present even with the idea of the who's doing the talking that we've used before to diagnose who's important in the story. Okay, because in chapter 1, the king and Vashti don't speak to one another. The narrator talks about them. But then when the king first talks, he addresses his sages, and Memucan is one of the sages who replies. And this is what gives us the idea that Ahasuerus is a little bit of a buffoon in a way. He's talking to people of lower status and then following their advice. And this also happens again in the next chapter, where he talks to the king's servants and gets advice from the king's servants. Okay. The plot of Haman in chapter 3 is interesting because the king promotes Haman and then Haman addresses the king. Okay, so we've got a lower status talking to a higher status. And then Esther and Mordecai having their conversation about what are we going to do. They're presented as pretty equal co-speakers in that situation of speaking. Okay. Also in chapter 5, the king and Esther talk back and forth with one another quite a lot. Okay. I just have really begun to dearly love chapter 6, where the king speaks to Haman and says, what shall we do? And Haman lays out this entire scenario, and then the king ends up turning it on him and doing it to him. So I would say that in looking for point of view, we have a lot of narrator point of view in here. We don't have quite so much character point of view. It does come up through speaking, but I still get the feeling that the story is very much a narrated story, and that the voices are given to the characters by the narrator as he's bringing the story together. Okay, so the return of the ring from Haman back to Mordecai is a great part of chapter 8. And then in chapters 9 and 10, we have the narrator again and the institution of Purim on the 14th day of Adar and the 15th day of Adar, just in case you need 2 days. There's reason for that, because if you were in the countryside, you might need more time to celebrate. Okay, and that brings the story to a close. So I would like to encourage you all to think about this story in comparison with Ruth. What do you see going on here as far as our female character and the protagonist in the story? I go away from the Hebrew version of Esther with a certain feel that gets switched out when I go back and read the Greek version of Esther. Now, it's important to understand those additions are actually additions put in there for some reason by somebody later. They don't fit in there smoothly as if it was put together at the first point in time. This raises the question of what do we do when our scriptural story seems to be even more of a pastiche than we would think. And I think that the RSV people did the right thing by putting the Greek version in the Bible and putting it in with the apocryphal books. So we do have it as record, but it's not the one we necessarily would read if we were reading for church kinds of ideas, for devotional reading and that kind of thing. But it does beg the question of then, why is God mentioned so many times in the Greek and not mentioned at all in the Hebrew? So there's lots of things to ask of the text, and it's really interesting that we do have this representation of one major Hebrew version and two major Greek versions to look at. And also to see where in our canons these books actually fall, because they are part of the places where things are not exactly the same. They're not in the same order. And because in the Hebrew Bible they're in the writings, we tend to read them as written writings, novella, story, a little more easily than we would if it was written, for example, Lamentations right after Jeremiah. We would probably want to read that with a more historical eye if it was tucked right in next to the prophetic text. So as far as Esther goes, let's be thinking about who she is and what is the main point you can bring away from the story of Esther. What would you say if you were teaching this book to a group of high school kids, for example? In what ways is Esther a good role model for females today? There's all kinds of good questions we could ask for application. And I think even if we read it as comedy, we could ask pretty similar questions. So I hope you enjoy Esther, and please do put any questions or comments into the question forum, and we can carry on from there. Talk to you soon. Bye now.